Whether you're trying to get a straight edge on a live edge piece of wood or a straight edge without a joiner, on this episode of Shopfix, I'm going to teach you how by building a joiner jig for the table saw. Stick around. To start this project off, we're going to need about a 2 foot by 4 foot piece of MDF that's 3/4 in thickness. By following my simple steps, you can create this jig in about 30 minutes. Alright, so the first cut we're going to make on this MDF panel is just rip it at 10 inches, and that's going to give our base panel for this joiner jig. Throughout this project, be mindful that the accuracy of the jig depends on the accuracy of your cuts and the assembly of all the pieces. With this in mind, it's important to pick an MDF panel that's very flat. Now, the next cut I'm measuring out here is the top piece that the T-track is going to be mounted to on our joiner jig. When designing this jig, I chose to work with MDF because I knew when I went to buy it at the store, I could get a nice flat piece to work with. Once you have one MDF panel at 10 inches wide and one MDF panel at 3 inches wide, you can begin assembling them together. Now, I recommend assembling them on your table saw and just lining up against the fence because you know that's going to be straight and flat. I happen to use a 36-inch long T-track for my joiner jig. However, if you want to build a longer joiner jig, you simply want to buy a longer T-track. Now, I'll be assembling these two pieces with screws along with this glue that I'm applying right here, primarily because the T-track requires screws to mount it, and also I wanted to use this joiner jig right away, so by using glue and screws, you don't have to wait all day for that glue to dry. Since this jig is made of MDF, it's important to drill pilot holes for all your screws that you're using for this jig. You'll want to use 1 1/4 inch screws to mount your T-track on the top piece of MDF. That way, the screw is long enough to go through both pieces of MDF and make that jig even stronger. After all the pilot holes were drilled, I simply secured the T-track onto the MDF with those 1 1/4 inch screws. Now, the accuracy of this jig relies on the straightness of the side that has the T-track mounted to it. So you're going to want to square that up with a jointer or table saw as I am here. Next, we can trim the sides to the desired lengths with the miter saw. You'll want to customize the length of your joiner jig to the length of the boards that you plan on cutting. I plan on cutting boards less than 4 feet, so I didn't need a super long joiner jig. Another thing you can do with this joiner jig to personalize it is match the width of the base panel to the width of the boards that you plan on jointing. So if you plan on jointing very large pieces of lumber, say 12+ inches in width, you can make that base panel much wider. However, if you plan on jointing boards that are less than 6 inches, you can make it a little bit thinner, and that's going to make it a lot easier to work with. Next, you want to mount your hold down clamps onto the T-track. Now, I don't have any preference as far as the brand of T-track or hold down clamps that I'm using. However, I am using Powertec, so I'll throw that out there in case you're wondering which brand you should choose. I found that these work great, and I've tested them out thoroughly, and I've come to find that the clamping pressure in which these hold down clamps create is really perfect for this project. Now let's go ahead and check out the operation of this custom joiner jig. First, you're going to want to line your board onto the joiner jig as to align the cut to the desired width. Next, you want to raise the blade about a 1/2 inch above the highest point of the board. After you have your board aligned on your joiner jig, you'll just go ahead and clamp it down by using those star knobs on the hold down clamps. Be sure to apply an ample amount of clamping pressure onto those hold down clamps. To accurately align your cut when using a joiner jig, you can simply use a framing square along your table saw fence on top of the board that you plan to cut out. Now we'll simply transfer that measurement and lock in our table saw fence. Now it's time to cut out this live edge board. When ripping boards out with this joiner jig, you want to make sure that the blade is not going to cross over the path of the MDF, which could cause damage to the joiner jig. Now, sending the board through on a joiner jig is definitely kind of a different feeling when you're ripping on the table saw. You might want to actually practice pushing that joiner jig through before you try to cut with it the first time. It might give you a better feeling on how that's going to operate when you actually go to cut. The whole idea behind a jointer jig is that it provides you an easy, reliable way to get straight edges on boards you may otherwise not be able to. Now the biggest problem would be that after cutting this out on the jointer jig, that board not be perfectly straight. If it's not perfectly straight, the problem probably lies within the side that has the T-track that rests up against your table saw fence. If that side is not perfectly straight, it's not going to produce a straight edge on the board that you send through. So to correct this, you can send that edge through a jointer or use a hand plane to make sure that edge with the T-track is perfectly straight. So when you send it to the table saw, it'll rest against that table saw fence. Perfect. Once you have your jointer jig dialed in, you're going to get repeatable, accurate cuts every time. And I absolutely love this jig. It's so quick and easy to use. It's simple, there's not a lot of moving parts, and it was easy to build. If you have any questions about the design of my jointer jig, the assembly, or the operation of the jig itself, please write me a comment and I'll get right back to you. Shopfix was created for the love of woodworking, so if you share that passion, consider subscribing today. For longtime subscribers, thank you for your continued support. I wish everyone best of luck with their future woodworking projects. Take care.